Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we're going to introduce how to get hair set up and functioning in Redshift. And so let's go ahead and get started. So to begin, we are going to take and just create a sphere. Doesn't matter how many polygons it has, we're just going to be using it as a default object. And the way hair works in Cinema 4D is that you need to create an object, you have it selected, and then you go up to the menu at the top of the screen. Obviously in Windows, it's up here somewhere. On the Mac, it's all the way up here. And you want to go to Simulate. And under Simulate, there's this hair objects. Now, we have hair, feathers, and fur. Feathers are hard, and we're not going to deal with feathers right now. Fur does not seem to render correctly in Redshift, although I may try something as soon as I get done with this little section of the tutorial and find out that I'm wrong. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and click on Add Hair. And what that does is it's going to add hair to whatever object we had selected. And you'll note that if I have my hair object selected here down in my parameters or my attributes, you'll see the link is set to sphere, which is this sphere. That basically says what should this hair object be applied to. I want you to note that there's also this little hair material tag here. And so we've got this hair material, which is like the default hair material. Now, something else about hair is that hair reacts to physics and gravity and all of those things. So if you hit play on your play head here, you will actually watch the hair bounce around and drop and fall based on gravity, right? Which is pretty awesome. We're going to go back to just having a big poof ball, which is basically clicking it back to frame 0 in our timeline. We haven't really talked about timelines much in this class because we haven't needed to. We're just doing modeling. We're not doing animation. So this is where things change a little bit more. All right, so we've got this set. So let's open up Redshift Render View and see what we get just by default. So I'm going to go to my Redshift tab here. Obviously, right, you can always just open up Redshift Render View. You can hold this down, go to RS at Render View, and get going. And if you aren't seeing RS Render View as an option, you can go to Edit Render Settings and just make sure you have your renderer set to Redshift. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit play on my thing, and you can see that I've kind of got some color on here. And I've got this big poof ball in the middle of nothing, right, covered in hair. So if I go ahead and hit play on my playhead for a few frames, and right, it's trying to render at the same time, which is why it's going so slow. I'm going to pause this here, and then that should update, and you can kind of see what's happening. Now, one of the issues is the hair material somewhat gives color to the hair, but it's not 100% effective, and there's certain things that make it look much more washed out and gray like this, right? If I open up my hair material tab here, you'll see there's a whole bunch of options and of things that we can work with. Right now, we're going to be just focused on the 3 default things that are turned on, and that's going to be our color. And so I'm going to change the color to something completely outlandish for hair, unless your hair is dyed. So we're going to go to blue, and then let's do pink at the tips. Okay, so wow, that is gorgeous, right? So you can see that I've actually got color working. Now, earlier today when I did this, it was just showing up grayscale. The hair was absolutely grayscale. And so there's another material that we can add that may help that. So I'm not sure, honestly, I'm not sure what the difference is between what I just did and what I did earlier today when I was testing this and it was grayscale. But if it is just grayscale, then the thing that helps is to go ahead and in your material manager, come down here and go to and create a principled hair material. The principled hair material is a Redshift hair material, and it works in conjunction with this hair mat that we've got here as well. And so what we need to do is we just drag this principled hair material, and we're going to drop it on our hair object, right? And now you'll notice that it goes very dark in color. I'm going to go ahead and drop a light in here. And this might be where the problem comes in. We'll see. I'm going to go ahead and let's do, so we actually have like color and stuff on here. Let's just do a RS Sun and Sky rig for the time being. And I'm going to rotate my view a bit so we can actually see the horizon line. So I'm going to hold down 3 and just rotate this until we can see the horizon line. All right, now you'll see that the hair is very, very dark right now. It's very brown. And the reason for that is if I go ahead and double click on my principled hair, you'll see what it's doing is it's taking my hair attributes from here, and it's feeding into this principled hair, and then it outputs it. And if I look at the principled hair, if I look at this, there's nothing I can adjust, right? And that's just because it's basically just connecting the two things together. But if I come down here, you'll see that the tint for reflection and transmission is on this hair attribute. The albedo, which is also, like basically your base color, is also set to this hair attribute. But you'll notice there's this albedo mix option, and it's currently set to 0. And then there's melanin and melanin redness. And so what these do is the principled hair basically creates like hair that's colored like human hair and has a couple sliders that allows you to adjust the values there, right? If I dial the melanin down to 0, I am going to get basically white gray hair, right? You're seeing it's going to take a while to render. But I'm getting this like white gray hair when I drake my melanin completely out. If I have just a little bit, it's going to be more blonde, but then this redness, right, is going to make it a little bit more brown. So if I was to also dial my redness, say, down to 0 or close to 0, I'm going to get a much more blonde result, right? And there's some darkness and things in here that aren't quite right, but it's slowly filling that in, as you can see, right? And so then if I instead was to blast the melanin up, right, that's going to be a darker colored hair, and it eventually gets to fully black, I think. And if I crank my melanin red up and draw down my melanin, right, that's going to result in redder hair, right? It doesn't actually, as far as I found, it doesn't fully cover the entire spectrum of human hair color, but it hits at least a decent range, and right, that's pretty much like almost black. But we're going to go ahead and leave these at 0.5-ish. And I want you to see what happens as I pull this melanin mix up, right? As soon as I start dragging this up, things are going to start changing, right? And it's essentially blending these colors with this color, which is actually creating a really gorgeous purple right now. But we're just going to go ahead and blast this all the way up to 1. And what that does is it basically goes through and eliminates this other material. Now, I do want you to note that it does take a lot longer for this to render when we're feeding it through the principled hair, right? If I go ahead and the color looks a little different as well, but it also looks, once it's done rendering, it looks really, really nice. But if I go ahead and delete this tag, right, I should still be getting, right, basically something closer to the hair color I had initially. But you'll notice it's not quite the same, and part of that is because of the color of the light and everything in the scene. Okay. So we're going to leave principled hair off right now just so we can see what some of these settings do without it taking 1.5 centuries to render. So I'm going to close that. And we're going to go ahead and open up our hair material. And with the hair material, some of the power in here are the different things that we can set. So one of the things we can do right now, you'll note that the length is uniform all across the entire thing. So if I check mark length, and let's say we set our length to 50% with 20% variation, you're going to notice right, the length is significantly shorter, but I'm going to go ahead and make my variation about 50% as well. And you'll see, right, I'm going to get a much shaggier, almost more natural looking hair. I know one student in the class is currently looking at modeling a wolf or a coyote. And right, their coat looks a lot like this in terms of the varying lengths. And you get that like undercoat and thing looking in there too. Now, there's other settings in here. Specular, so color, right, allows us to set the color. And this is from the root to the tip. There's some other options here, which we'll look at in a second. Specular color is like, what color should the highlights on the hair be, right? In my case, they're currently white, but I could say, oh, I really want these to be more of like a magenta pink color. And then when I do that, you'll see I get a much more pink result because all those highlights from the light are now essentially reflecting in the pink range. And I could dial this down a little bit to make it a little less punchy. There's strength, there's sharpness, we can use textures, there's all sorts of things we can do to the specular. Each one of these has a lot of different possible settings, right? And you can always right-click on this word, go to help, and it will tell you exactly what these things do. Thickness is one that can be really useful because whether we're making grass or hair or whatever, there's a lot of different ways that we can work. And so right now, by default, our hair is 1 centimeter thick at the root and 1/10 of a centimeter thick at the tip. If I was to go ahead and make this 1:1, you're going to see that I get a much chunkier result. This looks a lot like one of those like koosh ball, like stress ball things. And you get a lot chunkier result. You can also have some variation. So I can say 0.5 in terms of my variation in thickness. And I'm going to get, again, be able to add some variation in there and get some different results. So the other thing here is there's this curve. So if I'm going to say set this, I'm just going to go 2, not 20, 2 by 2 real quick here. And we're going to get like much thicker hairs. And then I'm going to go ahead and zoom in just a little bit so we can get a little closer to these hairs. So you can kind of see what's happening, right? And hairs, this is kind of how they look. They just look like they're like flat planes that end in like a little rounded end. However, if we use the curve, one thing we can do is we can taper the end this way. So I can do this and then wait a second, and you can see, right, now it's thick at the bottom, it's thin at top. I could also do the opposite, right? This is the root, and I could actually have the root be really thin. And you can't really see it here, but then the tip is much thicker. Now, other things we can do with this curve, much like any other curve in Cinema, is we can hold down Control and click, and we can add a point to that curve, right? So if I wanted this to go thin about 3/4 of the way down and then fill back out, I can do that. And you can kind of see these tapering down now. If I was to bring this much closer to the end, that effect would be significantly more noticeable. Right, yeah, so now you can see I've got these like teardrop shaped ends on the hairs. I'm going to zoom in just a touch more. You got to be careful because sometimes it wants to zoom a lot. Okay, so yeah, you can see I've got these teardrop shapes in there. Now you can also think about this in terms of like, oh, if I was making grass, right, maybe I want this blade to be pretty thick until I get right close to the end. Right, and so we can see, right, that's maybe a little bit too thick there, too thin there at the end. Let's pull that up a little bit and see what we get. Should round it a touch more. Maybe we need to go up a little bit more on this to make these a little bit more real, right? But so you can imagine that we've got a lot of different ways we can shape our hair. And okay, so let's look at some other things we can do. So other types of things changes we can make just on the hair material itself is this is where we control things like frizz and kink and density and clump and all of that. So if I go ahead and just click on frizz and just leave it at the default settings, you're going to see that, right, instead of hanging down quite so straight, it's a little bit more disordered. If I uncheck frizz and check mark kink, you'll see that, right, it's going to make it significantly kinkier and curlier and more crazy. If I check mark both of those at the same time, right, I'm going to get an even more varied result. And so these can be useful for creating all sorts of textures, all sorts of materials from mosses to actual hair, to grasses, to straw, you name it, you can, start to create things from this. And you can click on some of these other ones and just see what some of this does. You can turn things off. You could adjust these different settings and see, you can kind of see how those are sort of clumping together. Bend is really going to help curl it a little bit. this is, I don't have this set very high right now, but if we curl it up a bit more, we're going to get more bends in there, right? It basically means there's just a ton of different ways that we can work with things. Curl is taking things a little bit crazy right now, but that's all right. It looks cool. I don't know. It's not useful for me. We can do twists as well. And again, some of these are pretty subtle at this point, but you can really, with most of them, you can blast them out. And straighten would, I assume, just straighten everything, but, we don't have a whole lot going on. So if I, hit a few more of these, right, we can get really, interesting different results. And if I go back to my thickness, I have this set at 2 and 2. I could go back down here and I could set this down to, 1 and 0.2, and that should give us like a much finer, fuzzy, almost like a fur on an animal result. All right, so there's a lot that we can do here. Now, you don't need to use gravity and physics and all that to do this. One of the other things that you can do is there are tools for like brushing the hair and doing all of that. And we'll cover that in a little bit later tutorial, but I just want to kind of get into the hair engine and see how things are going here. Okay, so let's look at a couple other settings before we finish this up. I am going to turn off the frizz, kink, clump, and wave that I had on. I'm basically just leaving length, thickness, specular, and color on. And that's because for these next steps, we're going to be looking at other ways we can control length and things like that. So if I go to my hair object, and I go ahead and I'm going to pull this over a little bit so we can actually see. So the first tab that comes up when you create hair is the guides. And it tells you how many guides and what length they are and how many segments they have. So you can think of guides as essentially a whole bunch of splines. If I zoom in on this and hit play, I want you to note that as it's falling and I stop it, you can kind of see there's these points where it has joints where they start to fold. Those are my different segments, right? And so sometimes when you're curling the hair or you're really close up to it, you're going to start seeing those like faceted like corners. And that's when you'd want to increase the number of segments, right? You could also, it may be something, a special effect you're trying to do, maybe having very low number of segments would actually make something look really interesting. That's something to experiment with. The count for the roots are basically like these guides, right? How many of the guides should be on the surface, and typically they're set based on like the number of polygons, right? This is on the polygon vertice. So each vertex on this polygon is going to have, or each place the polygons meet. If I go to display guard shading lines, right, we should be having a guide at each one of these corners, and there's 482 of those corners. The length here is 100 centimeters. I could set this to say 25, right? And what that does is it basically sets the max length. And then our length setting on our hair material allows us to vary from that 100% down to a shorter length, right? But this sets the maximum length. And there's no reason why this length couldn't be 1,000 as well. So, right, we can make, and we might be in the hair at this point, right? But we could make this be like an incredibly huge fuzzball that's massive, or we can do things that are significantly shorter. Okay, so let's go back to making this shorter. I'm going to set it to 25 again. And I do want you to note when I set it to 25, one of the things that happens is that, right, I can actually see the sphere on the inside. I'm seeing the skin of the animal or head or person or whatever. And so oftentimes, one of the ways to cheat and not need as many hairs is to actually set the material color for your base object to be the same as like the root color for your hairs, right? And what that does is it allows you to, it just fills in that area and it looks better. You don't have to do that. Sometimes you want that to show through, but if you don't, it's a way to save on the number of hairs. So let's look at how we can increase hair density. If we go to the hair object and we come over here to hairs, the default set is 50,000, right? I'm going to increase this to 100,000, if I can count numbers right, number of zeros right. And I want you to see that right now I have much denser hair. There's a lot less of the surface that's showing through. But right, the more you increase the number of hairs, the longer that render is going to take, the more stressful it is for your computer to complete it. But generally, the better the hair looks. Now I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to pause that. I'm going to stop this real quick. I'm going to play this a little bit, and then I'm going to run this. Right, so now you can see, right, the color looks really different, and that's because it's essentially, right, all being reflected off the sky. Like I'm getting a lot of specular highlights on this at this point. If you don't want that, right, that's something where you could come into your hair material, go to specular, and set that strength to 0-ish. Oh boy. Let's see if that fixes it. And that might resolve some of that, right? It still looks bluish, and that may be, and that's probably because that's the base color of the object, right? We're getting that blue. And you'll see we still do have some specular even when I set the strength to 0 here. But I'm going to set this back to 60%. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop this, pop this up, run this again so it's at least where it's supposed to be. Okay. So we can set the number of hairs. Now, this is also, right, the guides have a certain number of segments, and the hairs have more segments, right? Really, when we're done with things, sometimes this is the best bet, is to like just boost this. You don't necessarily need to do the guides, but you can. There's a lot of other things happening here. One of the things that you might note, if I turn this off and hit play on here, is that my hairs kind of, when they fall down, they actually kind of go in, if they're long, especially if they're longer, they enter this body of the sphere. One of the things you can do to help that somewhat is if you right click on the sphere and you go to simulation tags, there's a whole bunch of these different things here. Is that where it's at? No, it's not. Hair, sorry, it's under hair tags. If you turn this into a hair collider, then what that does is it basically means that the hairs should bounce off rather than penetrating, right? And so they're going to hang a little bit further away from that surface. You can see, right, as they fall. Something else that's kind of fun to do with hair is you can actually drag this thing around, and you can kind of see the hairs flopping around a bit because it reacts to that too. So if you were animating something moving, you could render a frame of, right, with the hair motion as well, which is pretty awesome. But there's some other force that you can do. You can do like wind and all sorts of things. We're not going to worry about that right now. I'm just wanting to make sure that this one gets you to a point where you can actually get hair in here. Now, one of the other things that is very useful for people, if you're doing something where, say, you're modeling a cow and it's a cow that has patches of 2 different colored hairs on it. The way that you can make that happen is you come in here, and under your color, you'll see there's this option for roots. If I go in here, and we're just going to use noise because it's going to be easy. If I just go down to noise, and I select this, and I come in here, and let's go ahead and let's say some of the patches are, we're going to make it really ugly, but let's say some of the patches are red and some of the patches are a deep brown, because that's just going to be great. And maybe, actually, let's just make it green. It's going to be easy to see the difference. Now, at this point, it's going to be kind of smeary, and they're going to be small. So I'm going to set this to 400% for the global scale. And then I'm just going to blast the contrast out, right? Because I want very clear boundaries between these 2 patches. And so I've got that set. So now I can come up here, and I want you to note that there's this blend mode. It's set to normal, and mix is set to 100%. What that means is it's going to overpower this first setting completely. So if I render this now, And if I actually, you can kind of see the change there in the corner, but if I go ahead and jump this back to frame 0, and then pull out a little bit from my level of zoom and rotate my view a touch so we can see this other side, right? You can see that now I've got that, right? I've got very firm boundaries between this red and green. Now I could, right, instead of having this all the way up, if I wanted a little bit more mixing to happen between the two, I could drop my contrast, and you can kind of see it's actually mixing through that yellow. You can add, you could have an image be the source of this. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. If I crank this back up all the way, right, yeah, I can get this set. Now, what else was I going to say? Okay. So then if I did want these two things to blend, right, I could be like, oh, I only want this to be 50%. And so then I'm getting actually that pink and purple. They're kind of overpowering the green and red right now. But I could also adjust this blend mode. So, right, there's a whole bunch of different blend modes. I could say multiply. I don't know what that's going to look like. It might be, yeah, that's not really useful. But I could say add or subtract or freeze or heat or whatever, and you're going to get a different result for each one. Okay, so that's intro to hair, some of the very, very basic things you can do with it and ways you can get it to move. In the next one, we'll look at styling it a little bit and how to apply it in specific places and not apply it in other places. Okay, that's the end of this tutorial.